covering a silent movie, but we're not doing this whole video silently. Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not returning from a trip meeting the most terrifying being of them all, my mother-in-law, I'm here at Castle Wolfula reviewing movies. Well, we're unfortunately starting this year's June-Iversal very late, but it's here now. The first original June-Iversal, where I explore Universal Pictures' early cinematic history within the horror genre. I gave a bigger channel permission to use the June-Iversal name just because I'd feel silly policing somebody else using my dumbass puns. I got better shit to do, like reviewing Universal's original 1925 adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera, celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, starring the immortal man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. Mostly known today for its long-running 1986 Andrew Lloyd Webber musical adaptation that I've never fucking seen.
Listen to the music of the night.
The Phantom of the Opera began as a French novel titled in its native tongue, Le Fantôme de l'Opéra, by writer Gaston Leroux, first serialized in 1909 for the newspaper Le Gaulois. The novel tells the story of the titular opera ghost, a deformed man named Eric who hides the disfigurement he was born with behind a mask, and further hides away in a secret lair he constructed beneath the Palais Garnier Opera House he haunts. But Eric is drawn away from his self-imposed exile by the voice of a young singer at the opera named Christine Daae, who Eric becomes fixated on, with Eric trying to make Christine both a star and his lover, whether she likes it or not. Leroux's serialized novel was met with a mixed critical reception at the time of its publication, but The Phantom of the Opera became popular with readers, especially in its episodic format published in newspapers, which led to interest in film adaptations of The Phantom. The first film adaptation of Phantom of the Opera came in 1916 from Germany, titled Das Phantom der Oper, and like many early German film adaptations of Gothic literature, it was likely totally unauthorized and today's a lost film. There aren't even any posters or production stills that survive today of the 1916 Phantom of the Opera film. The only evidence of its existence is text advertisements, but if you happen to own a copy of the lost 1916 German Phantom of the Opera, maybe tell somebody about it. Unless it sucks, then that important film history could just stay lost, I guess. Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal, took a holiday in 1922 to Paris, where he met the author of Phantom of the Opera, Gaston Leroux, who gifted the film executive a copy of Phantom, probably hoping to land a film adaptation, and Laemmle read the novel in its entirety in one night, and immediately purchased the film rights to Phantom of the Opera, with the intention of this adaptation starring the one actor who could do the title role justice, Lon Chaney. Leonidas Lon Chaney began his career in entertainment as a performer in vaudeville, but marital issues arose with Chaney's jealous wife, fellow performer Cleva, which resulted in Cleva attempting suicide. This drama led to Chaney divorcing Cleva and leaving his vaudeville life behind for contract work as a character actor under Universal in order for Chaney to provide for his new wife Hazel and his son from his first marriage, Creighton Chaney, later known under his reluctant stage name Lon Chaney Jr.
I'm mighty glad to be here, Father.
Born to deaf parents and with a background in theater, Chaney had an advantage acting during the silent era of film. He possessed a command of sign language, which brought with it an understanding of expressive movement necessary to perform without a voice. And this was a time when actors still had to do all their own makeup for a role. So Chaney's extensive experience with this craft after his theater days made it so that Chaney could look any way he imagined, setting Chaney apart as a versatile commodity that earned Chaney the moniker of Man of 1,000 Faces. Chaney built a reputation of playing deformed, malicious characters, but there would be a layer of sympathy to these broken men. You could understand what made them evil through his characterization, like in Dracula director Todd Browning's 1927 film The Unknown, where Chaney plays an armless circus performer who secretly is a murderer with both of his arms intact, but when the armless man falls in love with a young Joan Crawford, who hates being touched, Chaney is forced to amputate his arms to be with the woman he loves, irreversibly becoming the thing he masqueraded as, only to discover the girl he loves is taking a new lover. Chaney's armless character is a horrible man, but it's hard to not still feel for him. His love is genuine. He goes to great lengths to pursue it, which makes his pursuit for vengeance all the more understandable and tragic. Chaney Chaney became a rising star under Universal, but his pay didn't reflect that, so Chaney sought work elsewhere, only returning to Universal for a few brief stints with two roles that have gone on to be the defining works of the actor's career. The first being the lead of Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of Universal's coveted Super Jewel productions. Yeah, about that. Unlike its competitors at the time, Universal didn't own its own chain of theaters, so it had to sell its films to independent theater owners, and Universal created an initially three-tiered system separating its film catalog by budget. Red Feather Photoplays were the bottom-rung, low-budget affairs, Bluebird Photoplays were the mid-tier films aimed at a larger audience, and Universal's Jewel films were the big-budget prestige flicks. Eventually in the 20s, though, Universal introduced a fourth tier, Super Jewel films. What's better than a regular jewel? A Super Jewel. And these Super Jewel films were a sign of Universal rising to prominence. These movies were more expensive than any films Universal made before, with budgets up to $2 million released annually. Super Jewel films included A Lady of Quality, Foolish Wives, and, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh boy. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, an adaptation of the classic Victor Hugo novel and starring Lon Chaney in 1923, was one of Universal's Super Jewel productions and became the studio's biggest success of the silent age. Lon Chaney had desperately wanted to play the role of Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame's titular doomed and deformed bell ringer, so Chaney purchased the rights to the novel himself, guaranteeing that he'd star in an adaptation. Lon Chaney almost went so far as to finance the film himself and shoot it in Europe, before he ultimately partnered with Universal on the project. Universal gave Chaney creative control and choice of director, and he ultimately chose frequent creative partner Wallace Worsley, though, according to co-stars, Chaney himself did most of the direction on Hunchback. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is not really a Universal horror film, though it has been retroactively treated by the company as one. It's really a dramatic epic, a tragic romance about a monstrous man who sacrifices himself to protect the Roma woman Esmeralda from a wrongful execution. But the film does feature elements that would be calling cards of Universal's later horror films, like the Gothic architecture, featuring a lavish, accurate medieval Paris set, some of which still stands today at Universal, complete with an impressive recreation of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Only the first floor is real, mind you, the rest is a model spliced into the shot, but still an impressive effect for the time. Hunchback of Notre Dame, like many future Universal horror films, features a grotesque monster in the center. Unlike most of Universal's later monster movies, though, the monstrous Quasimodo, despite his looks and standing in life, is a selfless hero. A Universal horror villain like Karloff's Frankenstein monster might have had some sympathetic and occasionally heroic qualities, but he was ultimately malevolent in nature. While Quasimodo was a steadfast good guy, a departure from the villainous roles that Lon Chaney was largely known for at the time, and it's one of, if not the greatest performance of Chaney, allowing him to show more vulnerability. But Chaney's Quasimodo makeup is also probably the best of his career. It's a total transformation of Chaney into a hulking, shaggy, slumped figure with a gnarled, rough face. But the warmth of Chaney's portrayal still comes to surface through Quasimodo's harsh features. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is probably Chaney's crowning achievement, his most impressive work, and a huge influence on Universal's future horror films, though Hunchback is arguably not as remembered today as Chaney's next and final film for Universal, The Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom of the Opera sets were literally built in Notre Dame's shadow. Phantom wasn't based on a time-tested novel like Hunchback. Gaston Leroux's novel was only written about 15 years prior. The Phantom had a lot to prove as Universal's successor to what was at the time their most popular movie. Still, there was a lot of enthusiasm over Phantom of the Opera at Universal, but that enthusiasm waned as the film's production faced various hurdles, mainly involving its director Rupert Julian, who was a hero for Universal, keeping the film merry-go-round under budget after it faced chaos under its first director. But with Phantom of the Opera, Universal quickly discovered that Rupert Julian was actually a mediocre director when put in charge of a production all his own. Lon Chaney couldn't get along with Julian and would only communicate with Julian through a mediator. But Chaney would famously tell Rupert to fuck off anytime Rupert did actually try to direct Chaney through the mediator, and Chaney would just perform his scenes the way he wanted to, which makes Chaney sound like a prima donna, but this is the only case I've heard of where Chaney Chaney behaved this way on set. He seemed to get along well with everyone else he worked with, so it seems more likely that the director of Phantom of the Opera was a talentless hack and Chaney saw right through him. And despite being the sole credited director for the film, Rupert Julian departed production before the film was even completed, either because he quit or he was fired. Nobody knows for sure, but Lon Chaney, Carl Laemmle's nephew Ernst, and Edward Sedgwick each finished directing the film uncredited, with Sedgwick helming the bulk of the film's reshoots using Universal's Western unit on the cheap. Phantom of the Opera went through multiple story revisions during and after production. Various cuts of the film were rejected by test audiences, and the ending had to be reworked from the novels, with the film heavily reshot with much of Julian's material removed, only for most of Julian's material to be restored at the last minute. Despite the Phantom of the Opera's difficult production, it has managed to go down in history as one of the greatest films of the silent age, featuring Lon Chaney's most iconic performance, and it heavily influenced the wave of horror movies that were to come from Universal in the next decade. But before I break down why Phantom of the Opera is such an important film that has stood the test of time, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday, and archive commentaries if you missed the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Here are the movies I'll be streaming next Sunday. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus streams, and I thank you in advance. The Phantom of the Opera, as the name very obviously suggests, takes place in an opera, the Palais Garnier specifically. Carl Laemmle wanted to shoot the film at the Real Opera House in Paris, but that would involve shutting down the place for an extended period, so Laemmle settled instead for building his own Palais Garnier within Soundstage 28, a special stage built specifically for the film. Through research, the makers of the movie found that Gaston Leroux took much creative license in his account of the opera's layout and appearance in his novel. I mean, Leroux described in the novel a lake beneath the opera house when it's really a cistern. So the filmmakers consulted an expert, Ben Carré, an art director who was among the rare few familiar with the opera house's below stage areas, where much of the film would take place. Carré drew 24 charcoal drawings for the filmmakers, who recreated Carré's artwork to exacting detail. The staircase and stage areas of the opera house itself were also recreated with the same level of accuracy. Comparing the real Paris location in 2025 and its 1925 American recreation, you'll find very little that was changed for the film. This makes Phantom of the Opera a bit different from Universal's succeeding horror films of the 30s and 40s. It attempted to recreate a real place through its set design. 1920s audiences who would never visit Paris would get to experience a recreation of the Palais Garnier at their local theater, witnessing a ballet like the real thing, though with the singing you'll just have to use your imagination. Whereas with most of Universal's later horror output during its golden age, the settings were created much more from the imagination through gothic and sometimes abstract design work influenced by German expressionist films like Nosferatu, though Phantom of the Opera still has some German expressionistic influences in many of the designs of its below-stage sets. Skulls and creepy statues adorn the place, and the entrance to the Phantom's lair itself is through the mouth of a demon. I guess it's not very subtle as a secret lair entrance, but who's gonna want to go down in there? It looks spooky. Speaking of spooky, there have been legends of a ghost that haunted Soundstage 28 itself where the film was shot. An electrician apparently died falling off a catwalk during filming, and since then there had been reports of a caped figure wandering through Stage 28. With the typical ghost shit of flickering lights and doors moving on their own. Yes, even Universal's set for Phantom of the Opera had its own phantom haunting the opera, but not anymore, unfortunately. Soundstage 28, the oldest surviving soundstage from the 20s, was eventually demolished in 2014 to add production space to Universal's theme park area. Before it was demolished, Stage 28 was right next door to the fucking Transformers ride. Really depressing. The actual opera set was preserved and saved from demolition, but that film history is just locked away somewhere with the vague promise of being displayed someday. Universal could have turned Stage 28 into a museum open to their theme park guests that could celebrate their rich history, but instead they focus exclusively on IP-driven rides when their original mission was to allow the public to experience the art of filmmaking up close. The stage was used to shoot scenes for many other classic movies, like the iconic shower scene from Psycho or the hatchery scene from Jurassic Park, but whatever. Universal needs to be able to build another fucking Minions ride. Speaking of things that were the oldest surviving from this movie, Carla Laemmle, the niece of Universal founder Carl Laemmle, played the prima ballerina in Phantom, and she was the final living cast member of the film, passing away in 2014 at 104, around the time Universal demolished the Phantom of the Opera stage. Coincidence? I think maybe. The Paris Opera House finds itself under new management, but the old owners warn the new during the sale that the joint is haunted by a ghost, which seems counterintuitive when you're trying to sell something, but the new owners scarcely believe in ghosts until they witness a shadowy figure in the fifth theater box who suddenly disappears without a trace. The Phantom of the Opera is initially just suggested throughout the first third of the film through Lon Chaney's silhouette. The only idea of what the Phantom looks like is provided by the account of Joseph Bouquet, a stagehand for the opera, who describes a man with a grinning, skull-like face with no nose. The lack of a physical appearance from the Phantom for much of the film led to employees at Universal questioning whether or not the Phantom would just be portrayed by Lon Chaney's shadow. Chaney's makeup for the Phantom was a closely guarded secret. Even production stills of Lon Chaney's makeup were censored by Universal to shroud the title character in mystery for audiences, building up further suspense for the Phantom's eventual dramatic reveal. The Phantom, Eric, is fixated on Christine Daae, played by Mary Philbin, a soprano within the opera, and the Phantom aims to turn Christine into the opera's new star in place of its reigning prima donna Carlotta. And the Phantom achieves these goals through coercion, threatening Carlotta and the opera at large if Christine doesn't perform, which surprisingly doesn't hurt Christine's standing within the opera or result in the police questioning her about her involvement with the Phantom. The only one questioning Christine's involvement with the Phantom is Philippe, the brother of Christine's lover, the nobleman Raoul, played by Mary Philbin's merry-go-round co-star Norman Carey. Philippe thinks that Christine might have a thing for this Phantom guy, but Raoul is convinced that he will be together with Christine in the end. It's just that Christine does kind of have a thing for that Phantom guy, who's promised her success if she follows his commands. There's essentially a love triangle between Christine, Raoul, and the Phantom, with Raoul representing the security of marrying a wealthy man, and the Phantom representing the sexy danger of following your dreams. At the time of this film's release, the story could be interpreted as a chauvinistic cautionary tale against women pursuing their careers, how it's a selfish, evil, doomed path, and that you should instead just devote yourself to some dude because he says so. But if you ask a woman who she'd rather be with, nobody is saying Raoul. The Phantom might look fucked up, but he's got style and is supportive of Christine's goals, devoted to helping her realize them at all costs. Ride or die, the Phantom is the ideal man, even if that wasn't what the makers of the film intended. Though, of course, the Phantom also just wants to control Christine and her destiny, but at least he's supportive. Mademoiselle Carlotta ignores the Phantom's threats and returns to singing, and while she herself doesn't pay the price for her insolence, her audience at the theater does, as the Phantom drops a chandelier on the crowd. And in the panic, the Phantom whisks Christine away, finally revealing himself to her, wearing a creepy mask reminiscent of the masks World War I veterans wore to hide their disfigurements. The ravages of the war subconsciously and consciously influenced the art of this era, and the appearance of many early monsters of cinema were representations of the public's shared guilt over the physical sacrifices that World War I veterans made. When the Phantom takes the reluctant Christine to his lair 5 cellars beneath the opera, Christine finds that Eric takes the whole Phantom thing a little too literally, sleeping in a coffin. The Phantom of the Opera was sort of a transition for horror movies at the time. For whatever reason, religious or not, studios at the time perceived that audiences would reject supernatural subject matter in films, which is why Carl Laemmle was so hesitant making Dracula. When there was a supernatural element within a silent era horror movie, it was usually a Scooby-Doo situation, a criminal staging the supernatural to get away with their misdeeds. Lon Chaney's Phantom was a stepping stone to full-fledged supernatural villains in horror movies. Eric is not a literal ghost, but he's dedicated to the act of making the public believe he is, to the point where he must believe it himself by slumbering in a casket, using trapdoors to make it seem that he can disappear and reappear in an instant. And Eric's dark, strange, but regal flowing outfits evoke those of Dracula, who of course also slept in a coffin and obsessed over a young girl as the object of his desire. Lon Chaney himself was desired by the Laemmles to play Dracula, and Chaney very likely would have, if not for his untimely death in 1930. A year before Dracula's premiere, and it's very possible that if Chaney had lived on through the 30s, he would have played Universal's entire pantheon of monsters. He was that versatile. Universal initially attempted to groom the eventual Dracula star Bela Lugosi to be their new Lon Chaney, casting Lugosi as the Frankenstein monster, until they found that Lugosi didn't want to be their new Lon Chaney, even if he could, which he couldn't. And not even an actor named Lon Chaney could be Universal's new Lon Chaney. Nobody could match the versatility of the original. That's why they called him the Man of 1,000 Faces. Speaking of which, during Christine's forced stay with Eric, she's instructed by the masked man that no harm shall befall her as long as she doesn't touch his mask. So of course, the very next thing Christine does while the Phantom plays Don Juan Triumphant on his organ is remove Eric's mask, revealing his gnarled, skull-like face. This was one of, if not the most shocking moments of the silent film era. The unmasking of the Phantom happens nearly halfway through the film after so much buildup. It's jolting to so suddenly see this face, unlike anything seen before in a film. It elicited screams and fainting from audiences, legend has it. Even the cameraman himself couldn't keep the Phantom in focus during his reveal, which enhances Mary's terrified point of view. Chaney's interpretation of the Phantom is one of the most accurate visual portrayals of the character, taking inspiration directly from the novel and its accompanying illustrations by Andre Castaigne. One Castaigne painting in particular inspired the Phantom's makeup for the film, but Eric's face is only half visible here. Still, you can make out the gaunt features, lack of a nose, and mouth locked into a snarl. What wasn't seen in this artwork gave Chaney room to offer his own interpretation. To achieve the Phantom's ghastly appearance, Chaney wore a skull cap with thinning hair. He padded out his cheekbones to make them sharper. He forced his ears back to accentuate his skull-like visage. Chaney used a pencil to make him look more grizzled and aged. He colored his eye sockets black to give them a sunken appearance. Chaney used wires to force his mouth into a warped grin with rotten, false teeth in place of his real teeth. Additional wires were used to push Chaney's nostrils up, while putty was used to diminish his nose, creating the overall effect of a living skeleton. It's not necessarily terrifying by today's standards, but there's still something weirdly unsettling about the Phantom's appearance that sets him apart from other screen monsters. There aren't sympathetic qualities, and his appearance isn't stylized or exaggerated. Chaney's makeup had a subtlety to it that made it look believable to startling effect in this film, and it's influenced so many future makeup designs, from Romero zombies to Tim Burton characters. They owe a debt to Lon Chaney's makeup as the Phantom. Lon Chaney's performance itself as the Phantom can't be discounted either. There's a sadness to Eric when he's masked. He's ironically more vulnerable when concealed, but when unmasked, Eric possesses an almost gleefully sadistic rage, revealing the true self he tries to hide, both inside and out. The Phantom, betrayed almost instantly by Christine, allows her to leave Eric's clutches briefly, but she must not meet again with her lover Raoul. So of course the first thing Christine does when she's released during the opera's masquerade ball is meet with Raoul. But unknown to Christine, the Phantom crashes the party disguised as the Red Death from the Edgar Allan Poe story, with Chaney's wardrobe directly inspired by another Castaigne painting. And the Red Death really brings the mood down. Color film had existed before Phantom of the Opera, but it wasn't commonly used due to the expense and limitations of Technicolor Process 2. For the Phantom of the Opera's Technicolor sequences, the camera simultaneously exposed two frames, one with a red filter and the other with green. An issue with Technicolor at the time was that the camera couldn't keep its subject perfectly in focus because it was technically capturing two side-by-side images, sort of like an anaglyphic image, so you traded picture quality for color, but the color in this case really makes the Red Death sequence of the film stand out as a highlight of Phantom of the Opera. The blood red of the Phantom's robe makes for a striking center point for the film. Color is used again to dramatic effect when Eric spies on Christine with Raoul on the rooftops, the couple planning to escape to England. The Phantom's flowing cloak is made red through a process involving dyeing the black and white film by hand, called the Handschigel color process. It's a very ingenious use of isolated color at the time to stylistic effect, something you see employed digitally today in films like Sin City. Phantom of the Opera actually originally had 17 minutes of color footage, but for years only the masked ball sequence survived in color. Many silent films that survive today are incomplete and pieced together from various prints. The most complete version of the Phantom of the Opera available today is still 15 minutes shorter than when it originally premiered, but recently color footage of the film's ballet sequence was discovered in Amsterdam, so there's hope of more being found. Technically, color is used throughout the surviving film today in the form of tinting the monochromatic footage, used to evoke different moods for each scene, a common practice used for silent films at the time. Tinting fell out of favor once sound was introduced to motion pictures due to expense and fear that the tinting process would damage the film's soundtrack. Speaking of the soundtrack, well, as a silent film, Phantom of the Opera doesn't technically have one, at least in its original form. The film score was composed by Gustav Hinrichs, but sync sound wasn't a thing yet, and silent film music had to be performed live by an orchestra. So this original Hinrichs score, as far as I'm aware, is lost, and subsequent re-releases of Phantom of the Opera for home viewing have used originally composed music. But the best remaster of the film from Photoplay Productions features a score composed by the late Carl Davis in 1996, and his music fits the film extremely well, to the point I thought it was the movie's originally intended score. There's a sense of looming atmospheric evil and intensity across Davis's score that makes it the perfect accompaniment of the Phantom of the Opera. During what was supposed to be Christine's final performance at the opera, the lights go out and Eric kidnaps his unrequited love, with Raoul's only hope of finding Christine being the Ledoux, a secret policeman who has been investigating the Phantom. In the original novel, Ledoux was known only as the Persian, an obviously foreign nobleman who is revealed to be the only friend of the Phantom, who tells Eric's long and confusing backstory to the audience. But at the last minute, the Persian character was simplified through a rewrite of the film's intertitles into a policeman named Ledoux. Elsewhere, the Phantom has killed the only other person to have seen Eric, the stagehand Joseph, but the death of one of their own causes Joseph's brother Simon and the rest of the opera's crew to seek vengeance against the Phantom. Eric the Phantom's portrayal in this film differs from the novel and many other adaptations in that he's essentially pure evil. In the novel, Eric was born disfigured to an unloving mother, and he tries to find acceptance in the world. But constant rejection forces Eric into exile and drives him to perform misdeeds to get what he desires. But Eric in the novel ultimately still has a heart. Lon Chaney's Eric is mostly a mystery. The circumstances surrounding his disfigurement aren't revealed. The only backstory Eric is given is that he's an escaped lunatic from the Devil's Island penal colony, a master of music and the dark arts. Not exactly nuanced, but this movie had a lot of scripting issues, and a lot of the story ended up being simplified. The final act is where the silent Phantom of the Opera differs the most from the original novel. Raoul and Ledoux find the hidden entrance to the Phantom's catacombs, but the duo finds themselves trapped in Eric's torture chamber, where they are subjected to extreme heat. But the duo escapes into another chamber filled with explosive barrels, right where the Phantom wants them, and Eric gives Christine an ultimatum through what looks like a puzzle from a 90s horror video game. If Christine turns the scorpion figure on the pedestal, Raoul lives, but she must be with Eric always. If she turns the grasshopper figure, she's free to leave Eric, but the opera house and everyone in it will be blown up. So after briefly considering killing everybody, Christine ultimately chooses the option with the least fatalities, but unknown to her, the water used to douse the explosives will also drown Raoul and Ledoux anyway. But Eric does the unthinkable, sparing his rival. From here, the movie was at one point supposed to have an ending where the Phantom is redeemed, similarly to the novel. Christine kisses Eric's forehead, and her goodness makes Eric realize the blackness in his own heart. that he doesn't deserve Christine, and the angry mob ultimately finds that the Phantom has died of a broken heart. This ending is lost, with only a few frames of it still in existence. There were disagreements within Universal over the ending, and the studio ultimately wanted a more dramatic finale where the Phantom is a villain to the very end, which was the film's ultimate ending. As the angry mob closes in on his lair, Eric kidnaps Christine again, because third time's the charm. But the barouche Eric steals to make his escape collapses, forcing Eric to abandon Christine as the mob approaches, allowing her to reunite with Raoul as the mob corners the Phantom in front of the Seine River. In his final act of terror, Eric leads the mob to believe he holds some new weapon of destruction, but he's just playing them like any great performer would. Even when he's beaten, Eric still strikes fear, but not for much longer, as he's beaten to death and his body is thrown into the river. This wasn't necessarily the end for the Phantom, though, as the film's $2 million success at the box office inspired Universal to make a talky sequel titled The Return of the Phantom, with the original novelist Gaston Leroux penning the screenplay, but Lon Chaney wouldn't return as the Phantom because he was under contract with MGM, who he worked for exclusively for the rest of his life following Phantom's release. The writer, Gaston Leroux, passed away in 1927, though, and Universal ultimately canceled the sequel, opting for a different, lazier cash grab by re-releasing the original Phantom of the Opera in 1929 with a synchronized soundtrack, featuring a new score, sound effects, and some newly recorded dialogue.
Yellow skin strung tight over protruding bones.
This version wasn't a full redub, though. Confusingly, only some of the dialogue was recorded, with some newly reshot scenes, but the dialogue of this re-release was still mostly silent with intertitles.
What is that?
Lon Chaney couldn't come back to record the Phantom's dialogue because he was under MGM contract, so the Phantom's dialogue is instead said by some kind of sidekick that works for the Phantom.
It was the master who tonight placed the music world of Paris at your feet.
It's very strange, and it goes without saying that audiences were pissed, and Lon Chaney was also pissed that Universal made this version without his consent. But the sound reissue of Phantom the Opera made Universal another $1 million in the box office for cheap, and inspired the studio to go ahead with their next major horror film, Dracula, though Universal would be forced to go ahead with this film without Lon Chaney due to his hesitancy to work with Universal again, and ultimately his death the following year. The sound version of Phantom the Opera is mostly lost today. The audio recordings of this version still exist, but much of the reshot footage hasn't survived. Fans have attempted recreating the sound version of Phantom the Opera, though, by recutting existing footage of the original version with the sound recordings, but it's not a great way to experience the film, more of a curiosity. The original Phantom of the Opera, though, in its silent form, is more than just a curiosity. It's an essential viewing for appreciators of film and horror genre history. It pushed boundaries and helped make further films within the horror genre possible. And it features the most iconic performance of one of the most iconic performers of the Silent Age. Out of Lon Chaney's 1,000 Faces, the Phantom is the most remembered for a reason. I give the Phantom of the Opera a U out of the Phantom she tells you not to worry about. But wait, there's more! Lon Chaney's career continued on after Phantom of the Opera, but he never worked with Universal again. For the remaining 5 years of his life, Chaney worked exclusively with MGM. A surviving highlight of Chaney's tenure with MGM was Todd Browning's The Unknown in 1927, but the most discussed of Chaney's films during this period was another Browning horror film released in 1927, London After Midnight, a film that possibly nobody alive today has ever seen, but anyone who's heard of it wants to see it. 75% of silent era films are lost, and London After Midnight might be the most famous of all these films. It was one of hundreds of movies destroyed during the 1965 MGM Vault Fire. Now, a great many of Lon Chaney's films are lost today, but London After Midnight has remained relevant above so many other lost films for two reasons. One, it was the subject of controversy when, in 1929, a British man claimed that Lon Chaney's character from the film possessed him to kill a woman when she wouldn't marry him. And two, Lon Chaney's makeup for the film is really fucking cool. Sort of vampiric with a shark tooth grin and a scalloped cape. London After Midnight is seen as a precursor to Todd Browning's later Dracula, but it was more of a spooky mystery where the supernatural elements are revealed to be fake, as was typical of the era. The film was criticized at the time for being confusing, but it essentially had a reverse Scooby-Doo plot where a detective disguises himself as a vampire and uses this persona to hypnotize someone into thinking it was the night of a previously unsolved murder, to discover who the perpetrator really was. Yeah, sounds pretty confusing. There have been fan recreations of London After Midnight over the years. Turner Classic Movies itself commissioned a recreation based on the film's script that used existing photos to try to give audiences an idea of what the film was like. And there have even been audio dramatizations of the script. Besides Lon Chaney's makeup and performance, though, it's been said that London After Midnight was most likely a mediocre movie. It wasn't well received at the time of its release, and it was only a modest hit, but Chaney's makeup for the film is among his most memorable and captures the imagination. I'd love to see London After Midnight, but it's likely that I never will.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Lon Chaney's final film for MGM, and the final film of his life, was, after years of hesitance, his one and only talkie, the 1930 remake of his 1925 silent film, The Unholy Three.
That's about enough for you, Tommy. Well, that ought to be enough for the silent.
While the film doesn't feature Chaney's usual dramatic transformations, the closest thing to that in The Unholy Three is Chaney in drag as an old lady, the film is a great showcase of Lon Chaney's voice as he plays a ventriloquist con man with multiple personas.
Why, you...
Chaney showed in his final film that he wasn't just the man of 1,000 faces, but that he was also a man of a few voices.
I hope you don't mind my bringing my grandchild.
Certainly not.
Ironically, though, Lon Chaney passed away of throat cancer in 1930, only a month after his final film was released. The first time many had heard him speak was also likely the last.
That's all there is to life. Just a little laugh, a little tear.
In the years following Lon Chaney's death, Universal had attempted to remake Phantom of the Opera, but it wasn't until the Laemmles were ousted from the company that a remake finally materialized in 1943. This time not only featuring sound, but also full color, and shot on the stage built for the original 1925 film. Lon Chaney Jr. hoped that Universal would cast him in the role made famous by his father, but Jr. wasn't even considered to play the Phantom. He was unfortunately treated more as a marketing gimmick for Universal's low-budget monster films. Chaney Jr. was never taken seriously as an actor by the studio like his father was. The role of Eric the Phantom in the remake instead went to formerly Invisible Man Claude Raines, who played Chaney Jr.'s father in The Wolfman, furthering Jr.'s resentment.
Now you will see that this evil thing you've conjured up is only in your mind.
The 1943 Phantom of the Opera had the makings of a great film, but it was misguided in a lot of ways that make it a chore to watch.
Leave Paris. This is your last warning.
Claude Raines was a good choice to play the Phantom, but he refused to play Eric with heavy makeup out of fear of being further associated with Universal's monster movies, and the remake was designed to be more of a prestige film, Oscar bait, being the only one of Universal's classic horror movies to win an Oscar, in its case winning for art direction and cinematography, and it's a truly beautiful movie. Its use of color is vivid, but it seems to intentionally avoid any of the creepy, atmospheric, gothic trappings of the contemporary Universal horror movies, elements that the original Phantom of the Opera pioneered and that personally appeal to me. The 1943 remake feels more like a straightforward drama with barely any horror elements.
Everybody, everything connected with the opera is so much a part of my life.
Eric in the remake originally was intended to be revealed to be the secret father of Christine, anonymously funding her singing lessons for the opera, but Universal feared that this would come with incestuous connotations, so the father reveal was dropped, but the film doesn't address why a man in his mid-50s is secretly fixated on and sponsoring a teenage girl.
A man of your age might win a young girl like Christine Dubois.
We agreed never to discuss my motives.
It's less creepy than potential incest, but there's still some creepiness here. One element of the remake that was copied by many future adaptations of the Phantom of the Opera is that Eric is given a sympathetic backstory.
Something has happened to the fingers of my left hand.
The first half hour is devoted to the Phantom's tragic origin story, where instead of being born deformed, Eric is an aging violinist who is fired from the opera when he reveals that his left hand has become useless.
You know, Claudine, the aim of the Paris Opera is perfection.
And Eric is left destitute, having spent all of his fortune on Christine. Desperate, Eric attempts to sell a concerto he's written.
I have written a concerto, Now, will you trust me if I can arrange to have it published?
Only for this to lead to a misunderstanding weeks later when he hears his music played by another composer and believes the publishing company is stealing his music.
You've stolen my music! Steve!
So Eric strangles the publisher to death, and in retaliation, the publisher's assistant throws etching acid into Eric's face. Who throws acid at someone, really? Eric, now scarred, wears a mask and becomes the Phantom of the Opera, attempting to continue aiding Christine's career from the shadows.
You're going to be a great and famous singer.
From here, the remake mostly follows the original's plot, but without the punch, without the scariness.
Take off that prop room mask.
There's just nothing menacing about Raines' take on the Phantom, so the film tries to make up for this with production value. Unlike the original film, the remake could depict an opera in full color with sound. You can actually hear the singing this time, and the extensively choreographed musical numbers go on for a while. But the reason I'd watch this movie is for the Phantom, not the opera. Because the Phantom this time around is also not overtly romantic in his fixation towards Christine, the film introduces a really unnecessary love triangle between Christine and her two potential suitors, Raoul, who is a stuffed shirt inspector in this version.
I hurried over to tell you something.
What?
That I love you.
And Anatole, another singer at the opera.
To see Christine is to carry her image in your heart and mind forever.
But the two dudes look exactly the same. Raoul just has slightly more facial hair. After Eric causes a chandelier to collapse on the opera's audience, like in the original, Eric whisks Christine away, but unlike in the original, this happens in, like, the last 15 minutes of the remake.
Sing, Christine!
And while Eric plays the piano in his lair for a singing Christine, she removes his mask, revealing that, yeah, he's a bit scarred, but he's not that freaky. A very underwhelming take on the Phantom's disfigurement after the Lon Chaney original. When Christine's boys come to her rescue, they fire at Eric, which causes his lair to collapse for some reason, with Eric trapped inside. An extremely anticlimactic ending with no resolution of Eric's connection to Christine, who goes on to be a famous opera singer, but she continues to lead on Raoul and Anatole, who finally give her an ultimatum to marry one of them.
You have to make up your mind finally and irrevocably between the two of us.
But Christine chooses her career over love, and Anatole and Raoul decide to, I guess, date each other instead.
Would you join me for a bit of supper at the Café de l'Opéra?
With pleasure, monsieur.
How progressive. On one hand, the film ends with what Eric always wanted, Christine realizing her dreams and loved by all. But on the other, it gives a tragic movie a very uncharacteristically goofy ending, like it was a comedy the whole time. Weird.
After you, monsieur.
The 1943 Phantom of the Opera isn't a bad movie. It's technically good and looks great, but it just isn't a very memorable or gripping version of the classic story. It's too restrained and too vibrant for its own good, and ultimately, it's just kinda lame. Universal tried to make a sequel to their Phantom remake titled The Climax, with Claude Raines returning as the Phantom. But scripting issues and the lack of Raines' availability led to the sequel being scrapped and The Climax instead becoming an unrelated opera film that starred Boris Karloff, with the only direct connection to the Phantom of the Opera being that The Climax used the set from both the original and remake. Ironically, another anti-climax.
His suffering and madness will be forgotten.
I give the 1943 Phantom of the Opera an Anatole out of Raoul. I was Lon Chaney's lover. Then go back and love him. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of their support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you liked this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more videos. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like private movie night streams with me and credits in my videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. Dr. Wolfula signing out.